How well do we really know the people closest to us? The ones we trust with our hearts, our secrets, and even our lives. Maggie Walker believed she knew. She believed in love, loyalty, and the values of family. She built her entire life around those ideals. But trust, as she would come to learn, can be a dangerous thing. When Maggie passed away at the age of 67, she left behind more than memories. What she left behind sent shockwave through her family and unearthed a truth no one could have seen coming. A $1.7 million life insurance policy, not left to her daughter, nor her husband, but to a name no one expected. A betrayal that ran deeper than anyone could have imagined. Maggie's silence had concealed a devastating reality, one that wouldn't come to light until it was far too late. Her life, her choices, and the final path to justice unraveled into a story that demanded to be told. And when it was all said and done, one question lingered above all. Why? Stay with us as we peel back the layers of this haunting mystery. Welcome to True Crime Story HQ. Thank you, dear viewers, and especially our loyal subscribers, for your continued support as we bring you daily updates on both told and untold true crime stories. If you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button and join our community. Maggie Walker's life was a portrait of strength and resilience. Born into modest beginnings, she learned early the importance of hard work, grit, and determination. Nothing in life came easy for her, but she never let her circumstances define her. Maggie's journey was one of reinvention, a woman who carved her own path forward. In her early years, she married the man she believed would be her life partner. Together, they built a small but hopeful life, raising their daughter Ashley and dreaming of a future filled with stability and love. But dreams don't always play out as planned. Her husband's unexpected death left Maggie a young widow, alone with a daughter to raise and no clear path ahead. Undeterred, Maggie threw herself into work. She found her footing in the real estate industry, where her sharp instincts and attention to detail helped her rise through the ranks. Her efforts paid off. She achieved financial independence and built a life of comfort and stability for herself and Ashley. Yet, for all her success, Maggie never lost sight of what mattered most: family, trust, and honesty. Her love for Ashley was fierce and unwavering. She gave her daughter everything she had never had: a private education, luxurious vacations, and a world of opportunity. But love is rarely simple, and parent-child relationships are seldom without friction. Ashley, accustomed to her mother's sacrifices, grew up emotionally distant, where Maggie saw herself as instilling discipline and gratitude. Ashley often viewed her mother's guidance as overbearing and controlling. This disconnect bred tension between them, a fragile bond that Maggie desperately tried to mend, but that always seemed just out of reach. As the years passed and the silence between mother and daughter grew louder, Maggie began to yearn for companionship. That's when Derek Thompson entered her life. At 53, Derek was 13 years younger than Maggie, full of charm and charisma that seemed to awaken something in her. He brought a sense of vitality, of shared laughter and companionship, things Maggie hadn't felt in years. To the outside world, their relationship looked imbalanced. Maggie was established, independent, and secure. Derek had a history, a past riddled with questionable choices, inconsistent jobs, and vague stories. Still, Maggie chose not to listen to the whispers. For the first time in a long time, she felt truly seen, and she clung to that feeling. Derek Thompson had always been good at reinvention. Long before he entered Maggie Walker's life, he had already left a trail of half-truths and broken connections scattered across several states. His charm was undeniable, an easy smile, a steady gaze, and just enough vulnerability to disarm the most guarded of hearts. But behind that polished exterior lay a man who had made a habit of attaching himself to women in vulnerable moments. His early years were a blur of odd jobs and short-lived relationships, each one ending with vague excuses and missing funds. In his 20s, he had been briefly investigated for exploiting a widow in Florida, whom he'd met while working as a part-time contractor. She had accused him of emotionally manipulating her into signing over power of attorney, but no charges were filed. She withdrew the complaint a month later, citing misunderstandings. By then, Derek had already disappeared. He resurfaced in Georgia under a different variation of his name, Dr. Thompson, and dated a retired schoolteacher battling early-stage dementia. Friends of the woman suspected something was off. Money vanished. Documents were changed. But once again, Derek managed to walk away before any legal action could catch up. By the time he met Maggie, he had refined his approach, gone with the quick grabs and desperate moves. Now, he played the long game. He presented himself as a man who had made mistakes, yes, but who had learned from them. He claimed to be searching for meaning, companionship, stability. And Maggie, who had always believed in second chances, welcomed him with open arms. She never knew about the other women. She never saw the pattern. But Ruth Daniels had always harbored doubts. She had watched Derek closely, the way he adjusted his stories depending on who he was speaking to, how he avoided questions about his past, the way his anger flashed, quickly and coldly, when challenged. Ruth had no proof. Just instincts born of decades working in other people's homes, reading the subtle cues they thought were invisible. Still, Derek had one more secret. Just months before meeting Maggie, he had applied for a small business loan using forged tax documents. The loan was denied, but the incident was quietly flagged by federal investigators. It remained dormant, unconnected, until Maggie's murder brought everything to light. And suddenly, Derek Thompson's carefully constructed life began to crack. But even as she embraced the warmth Derek offered, there was a whisper in the back of her mind, a quiet doubt she couldn't shake. Sometimes his compliments felt too polished, his gestures too rehearsed. Maggie tried to dismiss the unease, chalking it up to the cynicism that often comes with age. But deep down, she knew something wasn't right. She just didn't know how wrong it really was. There were signs, small things at first. A story that didn't quite make sense. A glance that lingered a little too long on someone, or something else. Maggie tried to dismiss these uneasy feelings, attributing them to her own insecurities. She wanted to believe in love again. She wanted to believe in him, even if a part of her stayed quietly guarded. But Derek wasn't the only challenge Maggie faced in her personal life. Her relationship with her daughter, Ashley, remained strained. Now a grown woman, Ashley had become someone who seemed to crave constant attention and validation, yet rarely returned the love and effort her mother poured into her. To Maggie's dismay, Ashley's behavior often reflected a sense of entitlement, a woman who had been given everything, but who appreciated little. Maggie continued to try. She offered advice, extended support, and reached out whenever she could. But their conversations, more often than not, ended in tension. Ashley felt smothered by what she perceived as Maggie's overbearing nature, while Maggie felt invisible, unappreciated by the one person she had sacrificed the most for. Ashley, Maggie said quietly, standing in the doorway, "You've been distant lately. Is there something you want to tell me?" Ashley didn't look up. "I'm fine, Mom. You always think something's wrong just because I don't act like you." "No," Maggie replied. "I think something's wrong because I know you. Or at least, I thought I did." Ashley's voice cracked with frustration. "You don't know me. You've never known me. You've only ever tried to mold me into some version of yourself. Still, Maggie never stopped loving her daughter. She held on to the belief that time would mend their wounds, that one day the gap between them would close, that love, in the end, would triumph. The cracks in Maggie's world began subtly, barely noticeable. Derek's charm, once so enchanting, began to wear thin. Ashley's actions grew more detached, her presence colder. And yet, Maggie, ever the optimist, clung to hope. She had rebuilt her life before. She believed she could do it again. Maggie devoted herself to her family. She balanced the roles of mother and partner with grace, constantly striving to keep things whole. But trust, love, and loyalty are fragile. And sometimes, even the strongest among us don't see the storm until it's too late. Maggie had fought many battles in her life, but nothing could have prepared her for this one. A betrayal so devastating, it would unravel everything she believed about love, family, and the people she held closest. It didn't begin with anything dramatic, just subtle moments, laughter that lingered a beat too long, glances exchanged when they thought no one was looking, a casual closeness that began to blur the boundaries of what was acceptable. The connection between Derek Thompson and Ashley Walker didn't explode into existence. It crept in quietly, like a shadow slipping through a crack in the door, hidden in the very spaces where trust was supposed to live. Derek had always been charming. That charm was what had drawn Maggie to him in the first place, despite the warnings her instincts whispered. But over time, that same charisma shifted its focus. Ashley, vibrant, attention-hungry, and emotionally vulnerable, found herself pulled into his magnetic orbit. At first, their interactions seemed harmless, just a friendly dynamic within the family. Maggie had worked hard to foster harmony between them, but underneath the surface, something dangerous had begun to bloom. Ashley's perspective adds a heartbreaking layer to this betrayal. In her mind, she wasn't simply participating in a reckless affair. She was searching for something she had long felt deprived of. For years, she had lived in her mother's shadow, smothered by the weight of Maggie's expectations and love that felt more like pressure. Ashley Walker had spent much of her life living beneath the weight of unspoken expectations. From the outside, she was the picture of privilege, private schools, lavish vacations, every opportunity laid at her feet. But behind closed doors, her world felt more like a gilded cage than a blessing. Maggie, her mother, had built their lives with strength and sacrifice, and she expected nothing less than excellence in return. Every decision Ashley made, what to study, who to date, even how to dress, felt scrutinized. Her mother called it love. Ashley felt it as control. As she grew older, Ashley learned to wear a mask. She smiled when she was supposed to. She said, "Thank you," attended events, and played the role of the dutiful daughter. But inside, she was unraveling. Resentful of the affection she couldn't seem to return, ashamed of the guilt that came from not loving her mother the way she thought she should. When Derek Thompson entered their lives, Ashley was already emotionally frayed. He saw that, or maybe he sensed it. Either way, he offered her something she'd never had, validation without judgment. He listened, laughed at her jokes, complimented her in ways that felt deeply personal. At first, she mistook it for kindness, then for affection, and soon for love. She began to rationalize the growing connection. This wasn't betrayal. This was escape. Derek understood her. He made her feel alive, not suffocated. In her twisted logic, Maggie had always controlled everything, even Ashley's happiness. Loving Derek felt like reclaiming something that had never truly been hers. But what Ashley didn't see, or refused to admit, was that she wasn't reclaiming anything. She was being led, manipulated by a man who saw her vulnerability not as something to heal, but to exploit. Derek became her escape. He noticed her in ways that felt new, exciting, even intoxicating. The compliments, the attention, the way he leaned in just slightly too close. It was thrilling, and it felt like freedom. What began as innocent validation twisted into something far darker. Ashley convinced herself this was real love, that Derek was her ally in a life where she constantly felt misunderstood. She clung to that narrative, even as the weight of their secret began to grow. "You can't keep hesitating, Ash," Derek whispered. "Every day she lives, we risk everything." Ashley's voice trembled. "She's my mother." Derek leaned in closer. "And she's in our way. You want us to be free? Then trust me. One more push, and it's over." But secrets have a way of showing themselves, no matter how deeply they're buried. It was a Friday night in early spring. The air outside was still, and the windows of the house glowed with soft yellow light. Maggie had gone to bed early. Her migraines had returned again, worse than usual. She had told Ruth she didn't want dinner, just rest. But around midnight, something stirred her awake. Maybe it was the soft hum of music. Maybe it was instinct. Maggie slipped out of bed, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and made her way slowly down the hallway. The house was quiet, except for a faint laugh, Ashley's. It floated from the kitchen. As she approached, she heard Derek's voice. Low, warm, familiar, and then silence, followed by the scraping of a chair. She paused just around the corner, her heart pounding for reasons she couldn't name. Peeking through the shadowed crack of the hallway, she saw them. Ashley leaning against the counter, smiling, while Derek stood too close. His hand lingered on her lower back as he whispered something that made her eyes sparkle. They didn't kiss, but they didn't need to. It was the way they looked at each other, the ease, the comfort, the intimacy that told Maggie everything. She stepped back into the hallway before they noticed her, breath shallow, limbs trembling. She didn't confront them. She didn't make a sound. She returned to her bedroom, closed the door, and stared at the ceiling in the dark. That night, something inside her shifted forever. "Ruth," Maggie said, her voice tight with pain, "if you saw something, if there's something I'm missing, tell me." Ruth hesitated. "Ma'am, I've seen things, yes, but I don't have proof. I just know something ain't right." Maggie sighed, closing her eyes. "Then I'll find out myself. And if I'm right, it won't be anger I feel. It'll be grief." Maggie, sharp and intuitive, began to notice the changes. Derek, once warm and reassuring, grew distant and distracted. His eyes no longer lit up in the same way. His affection grew forced. Ashley, too, had changed. Her aloofness now carried a defiance Maggie couldn't quite explain, a hardness that hadn't been there before. And though she couldn't yet name what was wrong, Maggie knew in her heart something was unraveling. It wasn't a single moment that shattered Maggie's world. It was a series of them, like puzzle pieces slowly falling into place. The signs accumulated over time. A glance that lingered too long. A conversation that abruptly ended the moment she walked into the room. A strange, unspoken tension that seemed to hang in the air every time Derek and Ashley were together. Individually, none of these moments made sense. But together, they formed a picture Maggie could no longer ignore. Her discovery of the affair came not with an explosion of emotion, but with the quiet devastation of a silent storm. The realization crashed over her like a wave, knocking the breath from her lungs, but outwardly she remained composed. Her heartbreak ran deep, not just because of Derek's betrayal, but because it was Ashley, her own daughter, who had crossed that sacred line. In the final weeks of her life, Maggie Walker lived in a quiet, torturous limbo, surrounded by the people she loved most, yet lonelier than she had ever felt. The weight of what she knew but refused to say gnawed at her daily. She had uncovered the truth. The affair between Derek and Ashley was no longer a suspicion. It was a certainty. And yet, she kept it buried beneath a carefully composed exterior. Each morning, she rose, fixed her hair, and applied a touch of lipstick the way she always had. She cooked breakfast. She smiled. She spoke kindly. But inside, her soul was fraying. The woman who had built her life from nothing, who had survived grief, single motherhood, and the ruthless world of real estate, was now crumbling from something far more personal: betrayal from within her own home. What tore at Maggie wasn't just the affair, it was the intimacy they shared in her presence. A stolen glance across the dinner table. The way Ashley laughed at Derek's jokes a beat too long. The way his hand brushed her daughter's shoulder when he thought no one was looking. Each gesture, each moment, felt like a dagger delivered with a smile. Maggie would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, her chest tight with a pain that had no name. She wasn't just heartbroken. She was grieving the death of a future she had so desperately fought for. The family she had tried to preserve was already gone, even though the walls still echoed with their voices. She had choices. She could scream. She could confront. She could burn it all down. But instead, she chose silence. Not because she was weak, but because she refused to let them see her shattered. She would not give them that power. In silence, Maggie planned. Not revenge, but justice, in her own dignified way. The two people Maggie had devoted her life to, had loved, supported, and sacrificed for, had conspired, whether knowingly or not, to break her. They were having an affair behind her back. But Maggie didn't confront them. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't demand answers. Instead, she locked her pain deep inside, choosing silence over chaos. Perhaps she understood that confronting them would change nothing. Perhaps she feared that speaking the truth aloud would break her beyond repair. So, she made a different decision, one that no one saw coming. Without a word to either of them, Maggie met with her attorney. Quietly, calmly, she amended her life insurance policy. The $1.7 million that had once been promised to Derek was now redirected to Ruth Daniels, her loyal housekeeper and confidant of more than 30 years. Ruth had been more than an employee. She had been a witness to Maggie's joys, her triumphs, and her darkest moments. Through decades of loyalty and care, Ruth had become Maggie's safe harbor, the one person she could trust completely, the one person who had never betrayed her. Long before Maggie became a successful businesswoman with a beautiful home and a secret storm brewing beneath the surface, she was simply a struggling widow with a toddler on her hip and no one to turn to. That was when Ruth Daniels first knocked on her door, responding to a modest ad for a live-in housekeeper. She was 22, recently laid off, and desperate for work. Maggie, overwhelmed and barely keeping it together, saw something in her that day, quiet strength and honesty in her eyes. Their connection was instant. In those early years, they were more than employer and employee. They were survivors. Ruth would sit with baby Ashley while Maggie took real estate night classes. When Maggie broke down crying after being denied a loan for the 5th time, Ruth didn't just make her tea. She stayed up all night, reminding her she was worth fighting for. When Maggie finally closed her first big sale, it was Ruth she hugged first. They built something together. Ruth had seen Maggie's heartbreak after her husband's death, her joy at Ashley's graduation, and the nights she wept silently after yet another fight with her daughter. Through it all, Ruth never judged, never gossiped, never asked for more. She stayed loyal, dependable, invisible to everyone but Maggie. That's why Maggie's decision to entrust her with everything wasn't rash. It wasn't out of revenge. It was the final act of a bond forged over decades, a love that needed no words, only trust. Ruth listened when Maggie needed to talk, and she stayed silent when Maggie needed to be alone. She kept her employer's secrets without question and without judgment. It was Ruth who first noticed the subtle decline in Maggie's health. It was she who stood beside her, day after day, never asking for anything in return. Maggie's decision to name Ruth as the beneficiary of her estate was not an act of revenge. It was an act of trust, a final gesture of love and loyalty, given to someone who had never broken hers. Maggie knew that Ruth would honor her wishes, that the money would be safe in her hands, that her legacy would not be squandered by those who had betrayed her. It was Maggie's final way of reclaiming control in a world that had spiraled beyond her grasp. She never let on that she knew. She bore the weight of betrayal in silence, carrying herself with dignity even as her heart broke. Her silence was both her shield and her burden, a powerful act of restraint and resilience. And though her world had crumbled around her, she pressed forward, determined to see her plan through. In the end, it wasn't Maggie's words that exposed the affair. It was her actions. By entrusting her legacy to Ruth, she laid the foundation for the truth to be revealed, piece by painful piece. Even in death, Maggie delivered her justice. Her final act was a quiet but profound declaration. Love and loyalty are sacred, and betrayal does not go unanswered. Maggie Walker never lived to see the fallout. Her decline began so gradually that no one, not even those closest to her, suspected anything was seriously wrong at first. At 67, she had been a vibrant, independent woman. She took pride in staying active and healthy. But then came the warning signs. Small things at first. Fatigue crept into her days, making ordinary tasks feel like mountains. Her appetite diminished, and the pound began to slip away. She brushed it off as stress. The natural process of aging, perhaps. But as the weeks stretched into months, her condition worsened. Nausea became a constant presence. Her skin turned pale, almost gray. Persistent headaches tormented her. No amount of rest brought relief. Doctor visits offered no answers. Test after test returned inconclusive. Her symptoms deepened, yet no diagnosis emerged. Specialists were consulted, opinions were offered, but none could explain what was happening to her. For a woman who had built her life on strength, control, and clarity, this mysterious illness was not just a physical blow. It was a cruel unraveling. And through it all, Maggie kept her secret. The truth about what had happened, the affair, the betrayal, the final decision that would reveal it all after she was gone. Maggie tried to carry on, determined not to let her failing health define her. She clung to her independence with quiet strength, refusing to show how much she was struggling. But as her condition continued to deteriorate, even her unyielding spirit couldn't hide the truth for long. Something was deeply wrong. Ruth Daniels, Maggie's longtime maid and closest confidant, was one of the first to recognize that Maggie's decline wasn't simply the result of aging. After decades of working in Maggie's home, Ruth had developed an instinctive understanding of the woman's rhythms, routines, and health. So when things began to change, subtly at first, she noticed. Ruth picked up on the tension in the air, particularly when Maggie's health was mentioned. "I see the way you look at her," Ruth said, arms crossed, her gaze steady. Derek scoffed. "Careful, Ruth. You're stepping out of line." "No, sir," she replied. "I'm stepping right into it. You might fool others, but I know a predator when I see one." Derek's concern often felt rehearsed, his expressions of care oddly mechanical. There was no depth in his voice, no real fear in his eyes. It was the kind of performance that might have fooled others, but not Ruth. Then there was Ashley, Unlike Maggie's friends and extended family, who expressed heartfelt concern, Ashley seemed curiously unaffected by her mother's suffering. Whenever Ruth tried to raise concerns or ask questions, Ashley brushed her off with vague reassurances. Mom will be fine. But her tone was cold, dismissive, almost as if she wanted the topic to go away. The indifference didn't sit right with Ruth. Something was off. Over time, other unsettling observations began to stack up. Ruth noticed Ashley and Derek frequently slipping away into whispered conversations, only to go silent the moment Maggie entered the room. Their behavior grew increasingly secretive. But the most alarming moment came one afternoon when Ruth caught Ashley adding something to Maggie's tea. At first, she convinced herself it had to be medicine, something prescribed to help manage Maggie's symptoms. But as the days went on, the timing felt too coincidental. Maggie's symptoms always seemed to intensify after those cups of tea. Ruth's gut told her something was wrong, but she had no evidence, no solid proof. Torn between loyalty and fear of making a false accusation, she chose to remain silent for the moment. Instead, she stayed vigilant, watching, waiting, hoping the truth would reveal itself. When Maggie passed away, it was a moment of heartbreak, but also of quiet relief. Her suffering had ended. To most, her death seemed like the natural conclusion of a long, mysterious illness. Everyone believed that, except Ruth. Even at the funeral, while others mourned, Ruth was haunted by everything she had witnessed over the past year. The inconsistencies, the behavior, the conversations that didn't add up. And then a revelation came that would change everything. The autopsy report. It showed that Maggie had traces of poison in her system, administered not once, but gradually over a prolonged period. This wasn't natural. This wasn't an accident. Maggie Walker had been murdered. For Ruth, the autopsy was both a vindication of her instincts and a call to action. She could no longer remain silent. With courage and composure, she approached the authorities. She told them everything about the whispered exchanges, the suspicious tea, the detached behavior of both Ashley and Derek. Her detailed statement became the foundation of a criminal investigation. It was Ruth's unwavering loyalty that brought the truth to light. Her testimony painted a harrowing picture of betrayal and premeditation, implicating both Derek Thompson and Ashley Walker in a crime that left everyone who knew Maggie in shock. What had once been viewed as a tragic loss was now exposed as a calculated act, one carried out by the very people Maggie had trusted most. As Maggie Walker was laid to rest, Derek maintained a facade of grief, but his actions betrayed his true priorities. He didn't wait for the investigation to conclude. Barely weeks after her death, he began taking steps to claim the $1.7 million life insurance policy. To those watching, his haste seemed unsettling. But to Derek, the money had always been the goal. What he didn't know was that the authorities were already several steps ahead. The toxicology report, the inconsistencies in his behavior, and Ruth's testimony had launched a full-scale investigation. Police began digging into every detail of Maggie's final months, retracing each step, each symptom, each visit. While the police quietly investigated Maggie Walker's death, another story was brewing, this time in the hands of local crime journalist Leah Burns. She had been covering cold cases and elder abuse stories for years, and something about Maggie's obituary caught her eye. A vibrant woman of 67, known for her health-conscious lifestyle, dies of an unspecified illness. Leah had seen this pattern before. She began digging, first into Maggie's business dealings, then her family. What she found was a swirl of contradictions. Derek Thompson had no verifiable employment history in the last 5 years. Ashley had recently cashed out a trust fund, despite no major life changes. And most curious of all, the amended life insurance beneficiary, filed just 6 months before Maggie's death. Leah filed a request under the Freedom of Information Act and obtained public records on Derek's financials. It wasn't long before she found an odd purchase trail: over-the-counter medications and cleaning supplies bought in large quantities, items that, when combined, could mimic symptoms of chronic illness. She took the findings to a retired toxicologist for review. He confirmed the theory. This wasn't far-fetched. It was plausible, even likely. The real break came when she contacted Ruth Daniels. At first, Ruth declined to speak. But something in Leah's voice, a blend of conviction and compassion, broke through the wall. Ruth didn't give a full interview, but she confirmed one key detail. She had seen things, and she was cooperating with the authorities. That was enough. Leah's article, titled "Whispers Behind the Curtains," "Was Maggie Walker Poisoned?" ran online 2 weeks later. It went viral overnight. Suddenly, the story was no longer just a quiet investigation. It was a public storm, and it forced the police to act faster. Eyes were watching now. Justice had to be swift and undeniable. And as the net tightened, their focus shifted sharply toward Maggie's own family. Ashley Walker was no longer just a grieving daughter. She was a prime suspect. Her daughter and Derek were the last people with regular, intimate access to Maggie during the final weeks of her life. Outwardly, their behavior raised few suspicions, but under closer scrutiny, the cracks in their stories began to show. Ashley was the first to be brought in for questioning. The police didn't begin with accusations. Instead, they used a strategy aimed at dismantling her emotional defenses. They started gently, showing her old photographs, images of birthdays, family picnics, and quiet mother-daughter moments. These weren't just photos. They were fragments of a life once filled with love, trust, and laughter. The emotional weight of those memories began to take its toll. At first, Ashley tried to remain composed. She insisted she had done nothing wrong, that her relationship with her mother had simply grown distant. But the detectives were skilled. They didn't rush her. They simply asked, "You loved your mother, didn't you? She gave you everything. So why?" Ashley's eyes filled with tears. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I thought," but her words trailed off, hanging in the air like a confession begging to be completed. The investigators leaned in, not aggressively, but gently, pressing forward with questions carefully designed to awaken guilt and conflict. And finally, overwhelmed by the emotional pressure and unable to bear the weight of her actions any longer, Ashley broke. The confession came in a rush, like a dam bursting. Detective Morrison leaned forward. "Ashley, why?" Ashley's lip trembled. "Because he made me believe she was the enemy, that we could be happy if she was gone. And now," her eyes filled with tears, "now I'd give anything to take it back. Anything." She admitted to poisoning her mother. Small, carefully measured doses slipped into Maggie's tea over the course of months. And most damning of all, she claimed she had done it under Derek's direction. The investigators didn't stop there. They needed to know how deeply Derek was involved. "Why did you do it?" one officer asked. Ashley's answer stunned even the most seasoned detectives. "Because he told me to," she said. "He said we'd finally be free, to be together, to live the life we always dreamed of, with the money to make it all happen." Ashley detailed how Derek had manipulated her. He preyed on her insecurities, made her feel seen and wanted, promised her love and a new beginning. But in reality, he had used her as a pawn in a calculated scheme to eliminate Maggie. Armed with Ashley's confession, the authorities turned their attention to Derek. When confronted, his reaction was exactly what they expected. He denied everything. "She's lying," he snapped. "She's desperate. I had nothing to do with any of this." But his protestations rang hollow, because by then, the evidence was undeniable. The forensic team had been working around the clock. The toxicology report confirmed that Maggie had been slowly poisoned with a substance commonly found in household products, one that required specific knowledge to be administered in lethal doses over time. Investigators discovered receipts for these substances purchased in Ashley's name, but all funded by Derek's bank account. The financial trail led directly back to him. Further analysis of Maggie's belongings revealed traces of the poison in her tea set and other kitchen items. These findings not only backed Ashley's confession, but also revealed clear signs of premeditation. The most damning discovery, however, came from Derek's phone. The police found a series of text messages between him and Ashley, messages filled with cryptic language and vague references that, when placed in context, outlined their disturbing plan. One chilling message from Derek read, "Stay patient. We'll have everything we want soon enough." With Ashley's confession, the forensic evidence, and Derek's suspicious financial records, the investigation became airtight. His efforts to deflect blame only made him appear more manipulative and calculated. The detectives had finally pieced together a horrifying narrative. A man who had married for security, a daughter, emotionally vulnerable and manipulated, a wife, slowly and methodically poisoned by the people she loved most. As the case moved toward trial, the full extent of Derek and Ashley's betrayal came to light. Maggie's life, once marked by strength and perseverance, had ended in suffering, but her death sparked the unraveling of a cold, premeditated conspiracy. Justice at last was within reach. But more than just a crime was uncovered. The investigation exposed the cruel depths of greed, manipulation, and betrayal. Maggie Walker's legacy would not be defined by the people who tried to destroy her. It would be remembered for the truth she left behind and the justice her story demanded. But in the end, it wasn't just justice that prevailed. It was the truth that finally brought them down. The trial of Derek Thompson and Ashley Walker began under a cloud of tension and expectation. This was more than a criminal proceeding. It was the unraveling of a story soaked in betrayal, fueled by greed, and rooted in the quiet strength of a woman whose love and trust had been repaid with unimaginable cruelty. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as every seat filled. Family members, friends, neighbors, and media personnel gathered to witness the drama unfold, a tragedy that had already stunned the community. At the center of it all were two figures, Derek, stoic and emotionless, and Ashley, whose eyes revealed the heavy burden of guilt she could no longer hide. The prosecution began with precision, laying out the horrifying timeline of Maggie Walker's decline. Forensic experts explained in meticulous detail how the poison had been administered in tiny, calculated doses over months, ensuring a prolonged, excruciating deterioration. The evidence was clear. This wasn't illness. It was murder disguised as a medical mystery. Witnesses were called, friends and neighbors who had known Maggie for years. They painted a vivid picture of a kind, generous woman, a mother who had given her all to those she loved. Their testimonies brought raw emotion to the courtroom. Some wept. Others struggled to speak through grief. All of them echoed the same painful truth. Maggie had been betrayed by the people she trusted most. But the most pivotal moment of the trial came when Ruth Daniels took the stand. Maggie's loyal housekeeper and lifelong confidant, Ruth commanded the courtroom with a quiet, unwavering presence. She shared intimate memories from her decades of service, how she had watched Maggie build a life of resilience, only to see it crumble under the weight of deception. She described the strange behavior she had witnessed in the months before Maggie's death. The hushed conversations between Derek and Ashley, the tea prepared behind closed doors, and the growing sense of dread that something was terribly wrong. Her testimony was reinforced by forensic evidence and, most damningly, by Ashley's recorded confession, played aloud in court. In the recording, Ashley admitted to poisoning her mother. Her voice trembled with guilt, fear, and sorrow as she described how Derek had manipulated her into believing they could be together, free and wealthy, if Maggie were out of the picture. The courtroom was silent, stunned, absorbing the weight of every word. Ruth's testimony gave Maggie a voice from beyond the grave. Through her, the story of a woman who had endured so much was finally told in full. Her pain, her silence, and her strength were laid bare. Ashley's defense portrayed her as a young woman ensnared by the emotional manipulation of a man twice her age. Her attorney argued that she was vulnerable, confused, and desperate for affection, traits Derek had expertly exploited. And while there was truth in that, the evidence of her involvement was undeniable. Ashley wept openly throughout the proceedings. Her guilt was etched into her every expression, her every word. When questioned by the prosecution, she admitted to her role in Maggie's death. But she insisted that she believed Derek's promises. "I didn't want to do it," she cried. "I thought he loved me. I thought this was the only way." The jury deliberated for several hours before reaching a verdict. Ashley Walker was found guilty of second-degree murder. The court acknowledged that she had been manipulated, but her actions had cost a woman her life. She was sentenced to life imprisonment, with the possibility of parole after 25 years. As the sentence was read, Ashley's face crumbled. A mix of relief and devastation washed over her. And as she was led from the courtroom, she whispered an apology into the air, a broken plea for forgiveness that no one was certain was meant for them. Derek Thompson, on the other hand, showed no such remorse. He denied everything. He called Ashley a liar, dismissed the forensic evidence, and blamed anyone but himself. But the jury wasn't fooled. The prosecution had painted a clear picture. A man who married for financial security, who manipulated a grieving daughter, and who orchestrated the slow, deliberate death of a woman who had trusted him with everything. When a verdict was read, guilty of first-degree murder, Derek barely reacted. Cold and detached, he stared ahead as if it meant nothing. The judge, however, had plenty to say. "You betrayed the trust of a woman who gave you everything," the judge declared. "Your callous disregard for human life, your greed, and your manipulation of others for your own gain are beyond reprehensible." And with that, the sentence was handed down, life in prison without the possibility of parole. Maggie Walker's death had once been shrouded in mystery. But now, through the courage of one woman, the confession of another, and the persistence of justice, the truth had come to light. Her story would not be forgotten. Her legacy would not be stolen. And her killers would never be free again. You will spend the rest of your life paying for your crimes. With those final words, Derek was sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. For Ashley, the public's reaction was far more conflicted. While many condemned her for her role in her mother's death, others viewed her as a tragic figure, manipulated by a man who preyed on her vulnerabilities. Still, sympathy could not erase the truth. Few could forgive her betrayal. The trial became more than a courtroom drama. It became a cautionary tale, a sobering reminder of the devastating consequences of unchecked greed and the irreparable damage betrayal can cause. Maggie Walker's story, though filled with heartbreak, left an indelible mark. Justice was served, and her legacy endured. Before her death, Maggie quietly changed the beneficiary of her $1.7 million life insurance policy, ensuring that neither Derek nor Ashley would profit from their deceit. Instead, she left everything to Ruth Daniels, her lifelong confidant and the one person who had never betrayed her trust. It was a final act of clarity, loyalty, and strength. Derek's life behind bars was defined by isolation and resentment. Ashley, racked with guilt, spent her days writing letters to her mother, letters filled with sorrow and unanswered pleas for forgiveness. Maggie's story, though tragic, became a triumph of truth. Her final decisions ensured the lies were exposed and her legacy protected. Her story challenges us to ask, what would you have done in her place? Would you have remained silent or fought back in your own way? Maggie's silence in life became her voice in death, a voice that demanded justice and was heard. Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you're moved by stories of resilience and justice, don't forget to subscribe. Maggie reminds us, even in silence, actions can echo louder than words. In the months following the trial, life slowly moved forward, but the scars left behind were far from healed. Ruth Daniels used the $1.7 million Maggie had entrusted to her not for luxury, but for legacy. She established the Maggie Walker Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting single mothers and victims of domestic manipulation. Through scholarships, legal aid, and mentorship programs, Maggie's story became more than a tragedy. It became a lifeline for others. Her name lived on, not just in court transcripts or newspaper headlines, but in the quiet victories of the women Ruth helped every day. Ashley, now serving her sentence in a state correctional facility, spent her days in isolation and reflection. She took up journaling, pouring out letters to her mother, apologies that would never be answered. The remorse that once felt like a passing storm now weighed on her like a second sentence. She had been used, yes, but she had chosen her part in the crime, and that truth would follow her always. Derek, cold and unrepentant, remained behind bars, unmoved and unvisited. Whatever power he once wielded with his charm had faded. He was just another inmate now, a man brought down by his own greed and manipulation. And as the seasons changed outside the prison walls, Maggie's silence continued to echo. Her quiet strength, her final choices, had shattered the illusion of love and exposed the cost of betrayal. But perhaps her greatest act wasn't in what she said or did, but in how she chose to be remembered.